digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined by Mookie, Marta and Mark. We have all the M's on the show today. So if you could explain for our lovely listeners a little bit more about who you are and what you do. I'm going to start with you, Mookie, because you are the longest standing member of this show. Why don't you remind our lovely listeners exactly all of the awesome, wonderful things that you do in the music industry and the VR and TV industries?
Oh, you're very kind. I'm proud to be long associated with the Digital Jam Sessions as a long-standing member. My name is Mookie Culhan. I'm an executive digital producer, and I work across broadcast and the music industries, across platforms on web and social apps, live streaming, and in the immersive content production like VR and AR. Last couple of years, I've been executive digital producer on The Voice for the BBC on BBC One, working on a couple of BBC shows now. And I've also worked very closely with several A-list artists and record labels. Within those projects, I produced a few good handful of 360 content that has given us really great flexibility on creativity, but also battling the challenges of movement in the space of 360 as well. So I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mookie. And Mark, as our newcomer to the show, would you care to explain a little bit more about what you do and your history in filmmaking and VR?
Yeah, so excited to be on here for the first time. So I actually am a VR producer. I'm a co-founder of Reverie Immersive Works and produce primarily 360 video content, but we're starting to move into the more game engine-based interactive content. And I got my start in independent film as a producer in there, produced several projects in there. And also at the same time, ironically, I'm also an entertainment attorney. And, a lot of people ask me, is there overlap? And I say, yeah, because actually this is, even in the legal field, VR is something that is starting to be explored and explained. But yeah, producing stories in VR is really exciting right now just because it's such, a new medium and everything.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. And Marta, why don't you tell our lovely listeners all about what you do from being a zombie through to being a Viking queen? Why don't you tell us all about the awesomeness of what you get up to?
Oh, I get up to a lot of things. Actually, more often I'm getting up to podcasting with you. But when I'm not doing that, I am a mocap performer, an actor, a voice actor, also an immersive theater performer. And basically another side of me is I'm also a digital marketer, and I've been working in the tech industry for a fair few years now. So there's a lot of crossover there, funnily enough. So I've actually worked on various projects, including Generation of Z. I've also made little appearances in the Justice League and Jason Bourne as an actor. And most recently been involved in a very cool 360 project with you, Tanya, and Mookie. So I've been jumping more and more into those digital media when it comes to acting and performing as well.
Literally
jumping in, and then sometimes falling and also pretend being killed horribly. But we're
not going to mention the fact that you barrel rolled me across a floor or anything like that.
This is true.
You
Tanya
loved it.
I barrel rolled Tanya, but then she did it right back to me and like 3 times over. So, I got my comeuppance. She got me back. But yeah, it's quite a interesting world that I live in at the moment.
Okay. Well, let's explore that interesting world of yours just a little bit more, because I am quite interested today to talk about performance in immersive entertainment formats. And I think one of the interesting things that I recall seeing at one of the combat labs was a bit of sword fighting, if I recall rightly. Now, this was not the Viking broadswords. Oh no, this was the rapiers, the rather small, thin swords, being wafted around by a large group of people around a 360 camera. And I do recall at the time thinking, this is not a fight choreography sequence. No, this is a dance choreography sequence. And I am quite interested from the perspective of your experience as the performer. At the time, obviously, this was being led by Ronan and Dan, who were choreographing, literally designing the dance moves as such. But there was kind of a lack of a 360 director, shall we say. And I am curious from your experience in the projects that you have done in 360, where there has been a lot of physical performance, and by that I mean combat physical performance required. whether or not there has been perhaps a little bit of a conflict of interest in terms of what the director might be asking you for versus what the choreographer, the stunt choreographer, is asking you for?
Yes, absolutely. But in terms of conflict, it means literally that, a conversation needed to be had. It was never at least in my experience, never in a negative way. Everybody's always been extremely professional. But these conversations that happen are extremely interesting for everybody involved. I find that, starting from the choreography side, yes, you're absolutely right. It is basically a type of dance in a way. I draw a lot on, I did ballet for 8 years, and I draw a lot of my ability to remember choreography, to do fight choreography safely, and to remember that sequence of moves, because everything is predetermined, right? To keep everything safe. And it takes an enormous amount of trust between performers. When you saw us with steel, rapier, and daggers, waving that around very close to each other, accidents can happen very quickly and very easily. And so it is very much a dance, and there needs to be an air of safety. And what I found is that because fight choreography in normal film media, like film media, relies so much on angles and on very, very close, like on close-ups essentially. And now you're working in an environment that's much more like a stage. It's open. There is no falling out of frame. There is no, disappearing. There's no trickery. You have a lot less to sort of trick the audience with. So now you have to not only make sort of a story through a 360 environment, so the person kind of knows where they should be looking at, but if they choose not to, there's still something essentially there. And on the other hand, there's also everything has to be a little bit bigger to seem, or closer up. You know what I mean? You can't close in the angle, so you have to make a movement bigger or more noticeable to create that tension, to create that a sense of excitement and action and danger that we experimented a lot in our project as well, where we brought people in, we put people further away, and so on.
Okay, so I'm curious from your perspective, Mark, in respect to experience directing live action performance versus some of the work that you're now doing in Game Engine. Obviously, with Game Engine, it's reasonably simple to kind of place the action where you would like to see that action happen and kind of juggle around with that and almost in some senses get a little bit of the control of frame back in some respects. Whereas when you're dealing with live performers, there is a certain degree of unpredictability, I'm going to call it, in as much as every take needs to be absolutely perfect all the way through the take in order to be able to ensure that you're getting the entirety of that performance. So there can't afford to be, one person who's just not on their game in that take, because you're going to need to do the whole thing again. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective how you're mitigating the differences between that live action 360 filmmaking versus that Game Engine environmental filmmaking.
Yeah. So, and actually to tie it back in with your previous question, it is an interesting thing, right? Because even I worked on an action sequence too. And, you have this issue of with actors in the 360 space, and, some of you are probably still, a lot of VR creators are still using rigs with stitch lines. I mean, all these rigs inherently have stitch lines. You do have to work with them to sort of make sure that actors stay within stitch lines. Obviously, in a video game engine, there aren't stitch lines. Like, there can be a stitch line if you have some sort of aberration in how you build it, but generally there aren't. So, it's one of those things where you do have to spend a lot of time coaching actors in a 360 environment so that they understand what's happening. They understand the stitch lines. Also, to a certain extent, you want to understand how close they're getting to the camera, because even if they're not in a stitch line, we're using essentially fisheye lenses typically to capture these environments. So, you can have sort of these camera aberrations like barrel distortion and stuff just from people moving, in and out close to a fisheye lens. All these things that you sort of have to account for. But in the VR space, in the more like game engine space, it's interesting to just, you can use motion capture suits. So it's a different set of factors that you have to take into account, just to make sure that the actors' movements are being captured. And then even with a motion capture suit, you're going to want to go back and refine, because motion capture by itself isn't that great. It's getting infinitely better than it ever was. I mean, there's people that are getting performances out of rigs now that like would have been impressive to like Weta 10 years ago, like the people that did like Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. But by the same token, it's just, it's really two different things, because one, you have this in the video game engine space, there's a lot more work involved in sort of cleaning it up and stuff. But by the same token, with the 360 video space, yes, you do have to take a lot of things into account. You can also use certain tricks, like, if you're doing a 360 video properly, you're really trying to utilize all the space. So there really is a reason for people to look around. So if you're doing that, you can do composites where like maybe you do two different takes, but something's happening in the background and you liked it better. You like what somebody was doing in the background in this particular take, and you like what somebody was doing in the foreground in this particular take. And then you can composite them together in After Effects, or like, I mean, I guess you could even do it in Premiere, but you're compositing these two and using two different takes, and which is also useful because especially when we're even talking about action sequences, one thing we did is we did a composite where we sped up one part of the frame, one part of the sphere really, and the other part was running slower, but we just found a way to sort of put the two together so that the action actually looked a little bit more intense.
Okay, so there's a couple of points here that I need to talk about. First of all, you've hit on one of my personal bugbears, so I'm going to rant about this. But one of the things that I find that a lot of people who are creating, and I'm going to say this is more in the respect of live action 360 rather than engine-based VR, is this need, this desire from a lot of directors to essentially, as you say, kind of create the action entirely in 360 around the viewer and literally give their viewer whiplash, because rather than having this smooth flow of action going in a particular circular direction or kind of being able to spot out the corner of your eye and turn towards it, there's this whole desire of like, we'll put something right in front of them and now let's make them swing all the way around the other way because they can look behind them now, so let's make them look behind them. And it's like this whole thing of like, literally, let's just give the audience whiplash. Let's make them swing their head around as much as possible. And it really,
what we don't want to do.
It really bugs the living crap out of me because so many people do it.
I mean, it's just uncomfortable.
Right. Yeah. So I actually do agree with. I do agree with that, though. It's you do hit this problem of ping ponging. Yes. Is the way I've described it, where you don't want it to be in front of you and behind you. It's a balancing act between doing ping ponging, but also encouraging people to look around between two takes. You do want people to like utilize some amount of the frame. Otherwise, people, if the action only happens in front of you for the entire experience or film, then some people are like, well, why didn't you just make it like a, linear 2D film? But
therein lies the issue, which is for a good chunk of the content that's being created, the real question is why? Why create this in 360? Why are you doing this in VR in the first place? Because frankly, this could have just as easily been a standard 2D film. But that, again, is just a personal bugbear of mine when I see somebody making content. I'm just like, there was no practical need for this to be in 360 other than the fact you wanted a shiny 360 video. But this is the very cynical side of me coming out.
But as producers, they're fun toys to play with. And I suppose it's...
But is that justification? Is it really?
No. I agree with you because there's no point. What's the point of skipping down the street if you don't need to skip? I prefer to sashay myself, but ultimately, from us, from a creative production point of view, we are intrigued by new lenses or new cameras or new gadgets and new ways to create the story. And how do you show the pictures in a nice way? What the bug is that we share together is when it doesn't seem to serve a purpose and the story isn't there. So yeah.
I'm gonna
just one more point, which was really interesting to see from a performer standpoint, is a few weeks after we wrapped 360 Fight Club, I was actually involved in a VR project as a motion capture performer at the University of Portsmouth. So I got to experience 360 live action video and that kind of production. And then immediately after, I was in this motion capture VR directed place where they were directing me from watching my performance through an HTC Vive, and it was streaming directly into Unreal Engine. And I found that performance, when they were thinking about it as a game, as that kind of interactive project, they were a lot more sensible in terms of how they used the space and how it was placed, as opposed to 360 video, which is exactly what you said, was let's just make this action everywhere because people can spin around. It is live action. Whereas a lot of that hype in the virtual world has kind of, matured a little bit more. So I think there's a lot to learn from how that is directed and looking at 360 video with a little bit of inspiration from what games have done.
I would take it a step further and say, actually, it's not just the games industry here that needs to be kind of learnt from, but also I think the immersive theatre industry has a lot to share in terms of the nature of staging, the nature of using that space, and the nature of interaction with the audience. Because again, here's one of those issues which I think a lot of people who are diving into 360 filmmaking don't really understand the true extent and scope of what immersive entertainment can actually deliver on, which is interactivity for the audience and the ability to influence outcomes, which is obviously in a game engine environment much more interactive and much more impactful in terms of what the user can actually influence versus a standard 360 video, which tends to be more of a consumption experience. But there's no reason why you can't make a 360 live action video an engaging interactive experience. And there's no reason why you can't add in those layers to activate a little bit of interactivity and a little bit of impact and influence over the outcomes of what they're actually experiencing. But I fear that there are perhaps too many people who are coming into this who are coming at it with a very traditionalist kind of filmmaking view. And that's no offense to you, Mookie, and no offense to you, Mark. Just saying that it feels a little bit like there's a lot of people who are still trying to figure out the artistic language in which they articulate themselves in the space. And so I kind of want to touch base really quickly there, Mookie, on one of the things that you were saying, which is, you've got a lot of people who are doing all these different things, experimenting in all these different ways. But one of the things that I kind of, I still say this an awful lot when I'm speaking at conferences, is that we as the kind of early stage content creators have a burden of responsibility to make whatever we're doing good. Because if we are, if there are a lot of people who are creating these live action 360 videos and chucking them out onto YouTube or whatever other platform they may decide to chuck it out onto, and all they're doing is literally creating ping pong effects for people to be literally whiplashing themselves to death, then a lot of people for the first time, that will be their first experience of VR. It's not a true VR game as such, not a HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift or a tethered headset, but something that's on a mobile device, something that they're looking at it, in a cardboard or a Gear VR or, something similar, where they're looking at this going, wow, is this really what VR is all about? It's giving me a headache, giving me a neck ache. And because of that, they're going to walk away from it because they don't understand the differences necessarily between the different types of format that are available for VR and 360. And so they look at that for the first time and just kind of go, oh, this is a little bit like hard work. I don't know if I really want to, keep doing this. And so I wonder if perhaps there needs to be more education for content creators and producers at the kind of the ground level to encourage them to maybe be a bit more considerate about that content. What's your thoughts on that, Mookie?
Yeah, 1,000%. You hit the nail on the head right there about, it's almost like taking responsibility, a production responsibility. And again, these kind of unwritten guidelines are being written kind of every day as we're doing this. What is the playbook? What is this? What is that? But I think ultimately when I'm creating something, I'm sure, Mark and Marta and you, Tanya, you agree that the first thing I think about is who's going to watch it and how are they going to watch it and where are they going to watch it. So it's a responsibility as content creators to making sure that it could be an enjoyable experience no matter what your level is. But if I know that I'm creating something that's going to be going out to somebody that's never experienced it before, I'm going to have a different brief and a different angle to take on that, as opposed to something that could be more game engine based and action packed and, treat things almost as two different verticals of production. But the people that we also share responsibility with nowadays, we've been chatting about this kind of stuff for a couple of years now. And if we listen back on an old podcast from 2 years ago, it will be definitely very different, because nowadays I think it's also the responsibility of, the marketeers and the people actually distributing this kind of content, and where are they putting it? How are they telling people about it? Who are they sending it out to? Are they dividing up into verticals of beginner, intermediate, advanced, things like that? And so what I've seen a lot more of is, these type of VR apps that will categorize it into beginner, intermediate, and advanced. So it can start to give people who are new to it a little bit more of a gentle introduction. And then people who are a bit more cynical, something nice to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And then people who are a lot more experienced, something really rich and super immersive. But I think what you guys will hopefully concur with is that the people that are really, really well advanced in that kind of proper 360 immersive, a lot more in that gaming space, have very high expectations, and they're probably not going to be watching a beginning level 360 film, while at the same time a beginning person is probably not going to want to have that to be their first experience because they're probably terrified of it. And that's just not your zombies, Marta. I'm talking about the full deal.
But I am interested, Marta, from your perspective, because you're obviously more on the gaming end of the spectrum. And I think that there is this interesting kind of nuance in terms of gamers have a different expectation when it comes to VR and 360. And they certainly have, I would say, a higher expectation in terms of the quality of content and how long that content actually lasts. Whereas I think that for the mainstream public and those people who are very much first timers or who, have only ever heard the context of VR, on the news somewhere and don't really understand what it's all about, those people don't have a terribly high expectation of what they should be getting for their money. And so I think that for somebody who doesn't have that gaming experience, there is, first of all, an expectation that content really isn't going to last much longer than maybe 1 or 2 minutes, but also the fact that they don't really expect to necessarily have any kind of a control over the content. Whereas a gamer automatically kind of reaches for the, the D-pad. They immediately reach for their console controller. Whereas somebody who's not a gamer, is almost at the other end of that spectrum where the first thing they try to do is kind of reach out to grab something, because that's the natural human instinct, is try and pick something up or, reach out and touch that thing.
They cry.
Or they cry. Yeah, that's very common as well. But
Yes, that does happen.
I'm kind of curious though, Marta, from your perspective as somebody who's within that kind of games industry ecosystem, whether or not you think that there is perhaps too high an expectation when it comes to the games industry and the games community specifically as to what their expectations for VR actually are, and whether or not perhaps they're being slightly, or when I say we're being slightly unrealistic about what we deliver.
I mean, I think it's a testament to just how amazing the games that have been created up until this point are. The expectations are that high. It's absolutely amazing. The worlds that have been created. I mean, when you look at, some of the bigger franchises like Uncharted or the MMO RPGs that just, the content is so immersive and the experience is so amazing just staring at a screen. Let alone, putting on a headset. It is just absolutely amazing. And people kind of get a little used to that. And so they believe that, they're spending their hard-earned money on a certain experience. And the more they spend, the more they have an expectation that this needs to deliver. And it needs to deliver the same level of immersion and detail. Especially the visual beauty of some of these things is incredible. And it's very difficult for a machine, just from a gear perspective, for a machine to process that level of detail in graphics for a 360 experience, for a virtual reality experience. And people are spoiled at the end of the day. I know I am. I game a lot. I am spoiled. And I do find a lot of these 360 experiences a little bit disappointing compared to the level of immersion I'm able to get from just staring at my screen and not having anything on my face. So I would say the expectations need to be consistent with the fact that this is still fairly early stage compared to what we get on a normal PC. This is very new when it comes to this stuff. So people need to be a little bit more forgiving, a little bit open. And let's face it, a lot of people don't have a lot of experience in giving constructive feedback. Their feedback comes in the forms of Twitter expletives and Reddits, or rather subreddits that are pretty difficult to read.
Oh, come on, that's comedy. That's my script.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's comedy to us, but to a poor developer who's spent their last 2-3 years in their parents' basement because they put all of their money into developing this. However, I have to say that recently, with some of the recent releases from bigger studios when it comes to Doom VR and recently Fallout 4 VR and LA Noire VR, like in terms of a narrative, LA Noire, I loved that game. And I'm so happy that it's actually in VR. And while there is still so much that needs to be better about it, I am very hopeful about that. And I think the community is slowly catching on as well, because you're bringing the familiarity of some of those games that they loved into something that they're re-experiencing in a new way. And we all know that re-experiencing some of those popular games sells, because look at Skyrim. Just how many remastered versions are they going to sell of that?
Okay, I hear you, and I take on board what you're saying, and here's my but. When it comes to some of these game franchises, and you've named at least two there, that for me, I feel that this is not about storytelling. This is about how many explosions can we make look shiny in a VR environment, versus are we telling a meaningful story that engages the user to want to keep coming back and experiencing that. There is a distinct lack of rich narrative storytelling in immersive environments. And so, Mark, I want to kind of come back to you when it comes to the storytelling aspects, that we do seem to be missing a certain degree of desire to tell stories of a deeper, meaningful nature. And by that, I mean, we're seeing a lot of very fluffy throwaway content when it comes to live action 360 experiences, where it's very much somebody wants to put a 360 camera in the middle of some action and let people have at it, and then that's kind of as far as they go. And on the game engine end of that spectrum, you have a lot of people who want to shoot stuff and blow things up or scare the living, crap out of people, but there isn't really much storytelling behind either of those. And it's very rare that we're seeing good quality storytelling narrative design actually emerging into this space. So I'm curious from your perspective whether or not you think that there is more to be done here, or whether or not there's perhaps a fundamental lack of knowledge, a lack of skill in this particular area.
Well, as you were saying before, and I totally agree, there are a lot of people that are hopping into this space directly from another space. Mm-hmm. So, there are people coming in from film, and I'm not going to talk about anyone specifically, but, there's projects that were made by prominent filmmakers, and when you actually see it, you're like, wow, I just kind of wish you had watched a lot of other VR projects that came before that were a lot better, because they seem to be repeating mistakes that people were making when 360 video first came out, maybe a year or two ago. And I think there's so much that can be learned. On the game engine side, I think there's still stuff that can be learned. I played a lot of Fallout 4. I think it's fantastic. I just think that, if they had simply played some other games, though, there's certain elements I think they would have picked up on and said, maybe this isn't the best way to do it. Especially what is it called? The Pip-Boy or whatever. It's a little bit complicated to operate on your arm when there's I've seen better implementations of a similar idea of this wrist-based communicator or whatever, operating system. And then, so there's a lot of things to sort of unpack there though in, how to add interactivity and narrativity at the same time. And the biggest issue that I think comes up is this idea of, we've been trying to have these empathetic storytelling-based cutscenes where people aren't thinking about interactivity at the moment. And people still malign cutscenes in video games. They've been doing it since, the 90s probably, where they're just this isn't the same medium. You're suddenly forcing us into a movie when we were just playing a game. So one of the things that I'm exploring with some of the projects that I'm working on is this idea of what we people use different terms for it, but unconscious or passive or, some basis of interactivity that you don't know that you're causing it, but it triggers different reactions based off of where you're looking or what you're doing.
So and kind of impact really narrative.
Right. So you're causing something to happen. You may not know that you're doing it, or you might do it subconsciously, but at the same time, it doesn't give people this FOMO where they're like, man, I missed the wrong choice, because it's like the joke, right? You read in the US, we have these things called Choose Your Own Adventure, where it's a storybook where you pick the pathway that you're going to go. But nobody ever cries reading Choose Your Own Adventure. Nobody ever felt bad when they died, because they would just immediately go back to wherever the last branch was to pick the other branch until they got the best ending. So it's an interesting thing to play with is how do we add interactivity where people feel like they have some level of agency and their curiosity is being rewarded, but at the same time that they're like fully delved into the story, and then they're fully emotionally attached. And I think that's something that as a medium we have to sort of push forward on as a subject matter, is how do we merge these two, interactivity and narrativity.
Okay, it's interesting that you're using that word empathy, because a lot of people in this space, they use that word empathy. And I'm going to throw this one out as a curveball, because we had Kathy Haxton on the show a couple of shows back. And she brought up this idea, this concept that actually we should stop focusing and obsessing around empathy and instead be focused around compassion. Because the problem with empathy is it makes us feel bad for whoever that person or thing is, but it doesn't make us want to do anything. And the nature of truly immersive and interactive virtual reality or immersive entertainment means that we want to interact. It means that we want to take action. And compassion is something that does drive action, versus empathy, which is very much about just kind of feeling that we are in that moment with that person or that thing and not doing anything about it. And I'm kind of curious as to whether or not perhaps Kathy's onto something here, in as much as what we should be looking for is compassionate narrative design rather than empathetic narrative design. What's your thoughts on that one, Mark?
Well, I think it's interesting what you're talking about, because what I agree. So what the thing is that I think when she's using the term empathy, she's talking about, you have a lot of these documentary-based 360 video experiences, which some people I've heard call poverty porn. It's like, it's like, here's this horrible situation. And then they don't give you a call to action. They don't tell you what to do. They don't say how you can help. And that's an interesting thing. When I talk about empathy, I'm really talking about sort of this heart of storytelling where you connect to the character on a basic level. But I think she's talking more about content, which I completely agree with. There are a lot of projects out there which, like, nothing comes to them. Like, what are you supposed to do? It's like you're here in this horrible set of circumstances, and that's it. It's just like a blink, in the blink of an eye, like, you see these horrible set of circumstances and there's nothing left for you to do. They don't seem to cause this level of, I need to actively get out and change that person's situation however way I can. I mean, and that's the problem with a lot of documentaries I see.
I hear you, and I fully agree from a documentary perspective, but I am curious from just a pure storytelling and narrative perspective. If we're experiencing a 360 film where something happens to a character and we feel bad for the character because we're in that immersive environment and we've just watched the hero or the heroine, have something terrible happen to them. And all we're doing is we're kind of riding on the coattails of their journey. Versus if we're in a game engine environment, the nature of game narrative design means that we don't just tell you that something bad has happened to that character. We give you that opportunity to interact with that character and to help guide and have impact on what happens next to that character or to the characters around that person.
And that's something we've seen for a long time. Again, one of the most famous cutscenes that I can think of that's fairly maligned is in Final Fantasy VII from the 90s, where Aerith, like, who's, I think she was, generally the love interest in it, she dies right in front of you in a cutscene, and you're like, I can revive anyone else I want in this game, and I can't revive her, and I couldn't stop that from happening. But by the same token, from a storytelling perspective, Final Fantasy VII would never have been the same story if she didn't die. So it's sort of it sort of causes everything that happens afterwards as a catalyst. So it's an interesting thing that goes back to, like, when do you give people choices to save someone or don't? And I know that people will be frustrated when they can't be the hero. But that's an interesting thing where, one of the things I think about a lot is how do we go from these, they're still sort of linear game engine sort of designs for even in VR, to something that's more AI based, right? Something like Westworld. In Westworld, as a human, like, if you're watching that show on HBO, as the guest, you can change the story however you want. And that gives you that freedom and ability, but it requires a high level of AI in order to sort of change the rules of the game on the fly, and that's something that's problematic, that I don't even think we're seeing games with the level of complexity that we could do that we could make a game where, you could just bust in and change the story up on the fly, because it's just not capable right now. Like, these machines just couldn't handle that. Like, they can't rewrite their own rules like that.
Interesting. You mentioned there the integration of artificial intelligence in order to be able to facilitate some of the scope of what would be needed in order to allow that kind of thing to happen. And that brings me to the natural question, which is, when we look at the future of where all of this is going when it comes to immersive entertainment, I think the one thing that most people agree on who work within this industry, in this space, is that we're going to need other forms of technology, other types of hardware and software that's going to help to facilitate what the future of this particular technology in this particular industry is going to look like. And artificial intelligence is definitely one of them. But what I'm curious to hear about is what other types of technology you guys think are going to be the key influences here, the things that are really going to make a significant shift or change in the way that this industry is going to move forwards. And one of the examples that I've given recently is I think that this year is the year of bone conduction technology. And we're seeing a lot of people who are going to be launching, in fact, in a couple of months' time this year. And the reason that I find the bone conduction technology so interesting is because it means that we can start to remove some of these layers of things that get in our way when it comes to immersive entertainment. So instead of having a headset and some big cans, some big earphones on our head, we can remove these earphones, because now the technology to hear this means that we don't have to physically block our ears. And so now that can just be part of the headset, and we can hear the quality of that sound without having to necessarily block out the rest of the world or have these things that block us around our ears. And I just think it's an interesting first step in beginning to remove some of these barriers and some of this physicality and weight that has to be placed on the body in order to experience this immersiveness. So I'm curious, Mookie, from your perspective, what types of technology you think are going to be the big game changers?
Big game changers within this space. I mean, what I've seen kind of, again, in kind of trade speak and industry type of forums is a lot of talk about, retina scanning and that kind of light field technology. Again, with the AI integration, the voice recognition. So you can dictate your storytelling and your adventure within your VR immersive space with your voice. So you could just be, and again, that could be possibly experiences for people who are disabled, or you're hearing impaired and you're visually impaired and things like that, things to help those type of audiences. The AI elements will get more sophisticated, and I think with the rise of like the Alexa and all the kind of speakers, AI speakers, was like one of the biggest presents over the holidays around the world this year. Mm-hmm. And I think those devices will become more sophisticated, that can enable the kind of every man, woman, person to get more involved and be properly interactive visually, emotionally, by speech, by sound, by sight. I think there's also a couple different types of devices coming out that will enable you to kind of use your senses as well. I nearly said sixth senses. You can see dead people. Like like a little bit integration of like a waft of like a scent, things like that, and those kind of memory triggers.
So, good old smell-o-vision.
Yeah, smell. Is that a word? Smell-o-vision.
Oh yeah.
Keep that as a hashtag when you post this. Actually, smell-o-vision. That's lovely.
So, Marta, what's your thoughts on this in terms of the types of technology that you think is really going to have an impact and kind of change the game, so to speak?
I just quickly have to mention, with Mookie's mention of Alexa, I mean, right now I use it as my helper to play through Destiny 2. Like, you have a little AI helper in game called the Ghost, and you can actually have your Ghost on Alexa. So when I'm not in game, I can ask him, what else do I have to do? What the flashpoint is, where the raid is, what's going on, So that's actually a thing already. And it's very cool. But in terms of technology, I would say, from what I've seen in motion capture, that is actually going to hugely influence it. I'm not talking about people like actors performing in it. I'm talking about bringing that into the living room, because right now you're kind of constricted by having to place these sensors so they can see where your controllers are and everything. But when you look at suits like the XSens and the Rococo suit, these are no longer restricted in that way, right? So you can actually move freely through a much bigger environment, and it's sending back data via Wi-Fi. It's very cool, but what I think is going to happen is it's going to play towards people's need to personify their favorite characters. You know, it started with avatars on forums, and now it's like full on cosplay where people literally spend more than a year building these incredible costumes. So what if instead of just a headset and a microphone and things like that, you actually put on this suit and put on the headset, put on the goggles or whatever it will be in the future, usually bone conduction technology for the sound. And you're able to walk in multiplayer into this universe and your friends see you as the character that you designed. I think so much is driven by the community that is within games, that the communities that form around these media, that to make it something that people who are not very techy and who are not just excited by technology itself, like we are, for them to want to join, you need to make it social. You need to make it sort of a social experience to an extent. That's how people are going to get that value out of it. So imagine that you can just put on a suit and a headset and walk into a virtual reality and people see you as you move in reality, and you can do the fights and everything. And you don't have to place that into your living room. You can place that into a gym. You can place that into a field, technically. You know, a lot of demos of these suits are in open areas. They're not in studios. So I think that's something that's actually going to help generate more and more interest and use for this. And obviously that coupled with good narrative.
Okay, I'm going to respond on a couple of these things because I think there's some interesting points here. First of all, I'm just going to follow up on the whole voice control thing and Alexa because, you know, Mookie kind of mentioned that it would be good for people who maybe have disabilities or people who are kind of less able. And actually, for the majority of the people who actually do have Alexa and are using... No, don't do it. She's blinking at me. She's blinking. Don't do it.
We said the A word.
Can't say the A word. No. But for people who have her, one of the things that they immediately begin to adjust in their life is their attitude towards what things they ask for and what. So something as simple as just asking what the time is or asking what the temperature is outside becomes some of the most popular questions that are being asked. Just because they can. And so it becomes this thing of, well, I'm not going to check my watch or I'm not going to check, you know, to turn something on to check what the weather is. I'm just going to verbally ask out loud. And actually the amount of time it takes for humans to become reliant on that verbal technology doesn't take a huge amount of time. So I don't think it's necessarily something that is about whether or not somebody has a mobility or an access issue. I just think generalistically, people will become very used to the fact they can just have a very natural linguistic conversation with the artificial intelligent agent, whatever it may be, that can help to enhance their immersive entertainment experience. But moving on to what you're talking about with the suits, one of the things that I constantly find very interesting is the intersection between fashion and technology. And one of the things that we have started to see a little bit more of is more and more brands, fashion brands, and when I say this, you know, big high-end luxury brands, wanting to get involved in kind of designing luxury versions of different types of technologies. And I think that there is something there in as much as if we can find this kind of suit that doesn't feel nerdy and geeky and techie and that thing that somebody puts on and just is like, I don't want anybody who knows me to ever see me in this thing, versus that cool hoodie. Do you remember the concept image that somebody did of the cool hoodie with the with the hood, and then you had the bow and arrow thing going on, and it had a little bracelet, and it looked really cool. Yep. It looked like something for Adidas, you know, or Nike or something, you know, that kind of thing. If we begin to see the technology kind of shift away from looking overtly obvious and into something that feels like a natural fashion choice, I think we're going to see a lot more people wanting to jump in and be involved.
I think you're right. And, you know, the very gimpy traditional mocap suit that relies on the cameras to see with the markers and everything, that is not a good look for anybody. Believe me, you're a walking strip of Velcro. There is nothing flattering about it. But if you look at the Xen suit, which is black and it has these like racing stripes at the side, that is a suit that you can put any kind of design on technically, because it's not obstructing any kind of camera. There are no cameras. There's the sensors inside of it. Well, so you can make it look as cool as you want.
You've got the things like the neuron perception suit, which actually isn't really a suit at all. It's just a bunch of straps, and you know, you're clipping them around the relevant body parts. And it can look quite subtle. It's not obvious that you're wearing a mocap suit as such.
Yep.
But it does the job. And sure, it can look a little bit strange, but if you're wearing black, you can barely see the straps. So I find that very, very interesting. But Mark, I am curious from your perspective, what is the technology you think is really going to help move things forward?
Well, there's a lot of different things. And first off, I love scent. To me, that is like you guys mentioned it before. It's huge to me. I actually have a strong sense of smell. So, and I live in New York City, so I'm used to uncomfortable scents. But it's one of those things where, it does define my world. So it's weird to me to be in VR and people are like, this is perfect. And you're like, well, I don't smell anything. Mm-hmm. I think the haptic suits are going to be big, obviously. I mean, we're talking in motion capture suits. It makes sense to do a motion capture suit with the haptics in it, so that I know there was glove that's been going around that has like inflatable air bladders in it that sort of give you pressure when you're supposed to be touching something. Mm-hmm. And then it also, I think they had a different version that had like hot and cold sensors on it or something so that like could give you that sensation. Mm-hmm. And there's a ton of other scents though that I think are senses rather that are I think people overlook. I mean, we have this sense of like our sense of our body in space, which is actually I think it's called proprioception maybe, and then that a motion capture suit will help with because there is this thing right now where like there's a strange awkwardness of the sense where people are like, oh, that's not where my body is in real world, like they can sense it. But yeah, there's a lot of different things that'll help trigger that. Again, I think AI is just going to be huge. And I think there's so many subsets to artificial intelligence. I mean, it's not just like, the conversational user interface, which is what you guys are talking about, this idea that you can talk to something and it, fulfills your commands. Although I think that's extremely important for VR. I let out a huge groan when I saw, I think it might have been Logitech. Somebody was talking about making a VR keyboard. And I'm just like, the last thing I want to do in VR is start typing.
You shouldn't need to type in VR.
Dear God. Why?
I hope it. But there's so many other things. In the last year, we saw an explosion in augmented reality, or what Microsoft's calling mixed reality.
No, we're calling it augmented.
Yeah. Okay. We'll call it augmented because that's what I prefer too. But, with the issue with that, though, is, you have a fictional character in your space. Now it's going to talk to you. If it talks to you, you have to calculate based off of the room what that sound should sound like at your ears because it's not going to be like reflected. Mm-hmm. And then also like if that character jumps and hits the floor, like how much does it weigh? What type of floor is it landing on? It's all these things that are parts of, I guess, computer vision. This idea that a computer or a machine understands what it's looking at. So if I'm standing on a wood floor, it has to know that like that's a wood floor. This is what hitting a wood floor sounds like. Mm-hmm. And we're starting to see the basics of that technology. There was somebody, I forgot which college it was. They were running around hitting everything with a drumstick, but the machine actually did it perfectly. It's like if you hit a drumstick against, a leaf, this is what it sounds like. If you hit it against a wall, this is what it sounds like. And it was actually tricking the people, the survey that they were doing it with. And yeah, I mean, I just think AI is like a large part of this that gets, but also, I mean, I don't even understand if people see that, like, it's just all converging anyway. We talk a lot about self-driving cars. Self-driving cars have to use computer vision. They have to see what's in front of them so that they can make a choice to hit, unfortunately, a squirrel, but not a human being. So it's...
You just got all of the squirrel lovers up in arms.
A self-driving car going to be AR, so...
You just put all the squirrel lovers up in arms. They're all going to hate you.
Save the squirrels.
But...
I know. I love squirrels.
I find it interesting what you're saying, but I am kind of, I suppose, curious in as much as, yes, we're talking about all of these different types of things, but one of the things that you kind of raised there, whilst artificial intelligence is absolutely, definitely interesting, the one area there that doesn't get enough love, not enough people talk about it, and actually is so fundamental. When we talk about the key factors, contributory factors to sim sickness or motion sickness within VR, whatever you want to call it, one of the key contributing factors is bad audio. And people do not understand the importance of the audio experience, the true 360 binaural sound within an immersive entertainment experience. They do not understand how fundamentally important it is to have good audio. And that's one area that I just feel that there aren't enough people who are necessarily focusing in on that space and enough people who are aware of what's going on in that space. Because as you say, there are people who are doing some really, really interesting stuff, but not enough people who are utilizing that interesting stuff, in my humble opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I totally agree on the audio as well. I think that's really important. I actually have talked to an audio engineer who was working in spatial audio, and he said he had to go home sick a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, wait, really? That happens because of audio? And yeah, people perceive their space more through sound than they do through sight. But what I think is interesting is, again, it's like, one of the other things too, I don't know if I would call it a technology, but it will get easier, is this idea of capturing one's 3D self. And there are like I know Amazon is making a version of Alexa that is supposed to have like a 3D camera in it, which I presume is probably to capture your 3D self. But when you capture that 3D self, it helps in a lot of ways. One, obviously we can put our 3D self into a VR experience. But two is also like, for calculating an HRTF, a head-related transfer function, which is basically this virtual version of your head, then the audio can be calculated through this algorithm based off the HRTF that makes the audio sound as accurately to, your head and the shape of your ears, so that it's as accurate as possible. And that's another thing I think going forward is you'll start to see a lot more VR customization, which not only helps with audio, it'll help out with stereoscopy, the type of sickness that's caused by people straining their eyes to see what we call 3D when they're watching a movie.
Making it comfortable for anybody who wears glasses, spectacles, to actually be able to experience VR without discomfort. Yes, yep. I think that there's lots of interesting things there to explore. But I am very aware that we are out of time for this week. And as always, we like to give our listeners a way to find out a little bit more about you. And we ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. Mookie, would you care to share with us your social media handle of choice?
No problem. You can find me at Mookie Approved. So that's the @ MUKIAPPRVED on all platforms, but I will probably quickly respond to you on Twitter.
Marta?
That, as always, would be my Twitter handle, which is @MartHolio. And yes, that is a Beavis and Butthead reference.
And Mark, what about yourself?
Hit me up on Twitter. My handle is @MarkAndster, MarkAndster.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter @DigitalJam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you, and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com